Hey guys, tonight we slip through the back alleys of Baghdad, past incense-scented courtyards and shadowy minarets, until we find ourselves inside a candlelit study where a man in silk robes dips a reed pen into ink and scribbles a phrase that's equal parts poetry and libido. The page he's writing? It's not a holy verse. It's not a letter to the caliph. It's a manual on sex. Vivid, unapologetic, and scientifically curious. You're standing in the 10th century, and yes, someone's just handed you what might be history's earliest annotated guide to getting laid well. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to post your location and the local time you're tuning in. I love seeing how far this sleepy little caravan travels. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lean against the latticework window as a faint breeze carries jasmine and something more pungent dates. Fermented. Slightly, used not only as snacks but as the first item in a long chain of suggestive prescriptions. You see, in this world, sex isn't hush-hush, it's studied, graphed, celebrated. You pick up a worn leather volume titled The Perfumed Garden, and suddenly you're in a universe where men are urged to study their wives' breathing rhythms. Like musicians learning a new scale. A woman is like the moon, one page purrs. You must wait for her light to rise before setting sail. Cute metaphor, but also strategic because according to the anonymous author, mistiming your approach leads to softness of bone and weakness of the knees. Which, if you squint, might be medieval Arabic for she faked it. Your fingers trail over drawings, yes, illustrations, of lovers in entangled positions, limbs forming shapes like cursive script. And the strangest thing, no shame, no blanket of moral panic. Just the calm, scholarly conviction that if the heavens made bodies, then understanding pleasure was a kind of gratitude. You're flipping through pages that quote physicians, poets, and yes, clergy, not just the brothel crowd. This was serious business. And in Baghdad's golden age, a city that glowed with science, philosophy, and absurdly dramatic court gossip, sex was more than recreation. It was medicine, it was diplomacy. It was, in some cases, a national security issue. One book even advises viziers to keep caliphs satisfied and supple, a political strategy. Not just a bedroom tip. Here's something wild, medieval Arabic. Physicians believed the quality of your semen reflected the balance of your inner humors. If it was too hot or too cold, too thin or too thick, it meant your body was out of sync. So what did they prescribe? Diets. Not just any diets, aphrodisiac food charts that make modern wellness influencers look lazy. On one plate, you've got honey, almonds, and melon. On another, roasted gazelle liver sprinkled with cinnamon. And of course dates. Always dates. Crushed into paste, brewed into wine, or mashed with sesame oil and applied topically. It's not clear if it worked. But imagine being the poor assistant who had to test it. Now, let's pause. You might think all this ancient sex talk must have been hidden in secret chambers, passed like contraband. Nope, many of these manuals were bestsellers, publicly read, often copied by court scribes alongside texts on astronomy and medicine. One caliph reportedly owned 100 volumes just on intercourse and delight. And while some were penned for nobles and scholars, others were made for average couples, written in plain, cheeky prose. Which means you, yes you might have, had better sex ed living in a 10th century Cairo apartment than in some parts of the modern world. Here's a detail that might haunt you. One such book opens with a line comparing the female orgasm to the bursting of a pomegranate. Sweet, messy, brief, but vital. Without this explosion, it warns, no fruit is formed. And this wasn't just metaphor. There was a theory still, debated among scholars, that women needed to climax in order to conceive. A few medieval doctors insisted it was necessary. Others, like Ibn Sina, the OG of Islamic medicine, disagreed. But you can imagine the effect of that theory on relationships. Let's just say it might have motivated some folks to slow down and pay attention. And that brings us to the cultural paradox. While Europe was tightening its chastity belts, the Arabic-speaking world was exploring sex as both science and poetry. Historians still argue whether these manuals represented widespread practice or elite fantasy, but the fact they were written at all and preserved sometimes lovingly says a lot. These weren't underground mutterings. They were bedside reading, possibly even wedding gifts. And despite how long ago it was, the advice sounds weirdly familiar. Listen, do not approach her in silence. Speak gently as the night bird sings to the moon. That could be a TikTok voiceover today. Except, back then, it came with footnotes on breath control and optimal pulse rates. Let's not romanticize too much, though. These texts weren't always feminist. Some definitely reflect the power imbalances of their time. But they also contain shockingly progressive gems like warnings against selfishness, encouragement of female pleasure, and an absolute roasting of men who finish first and leave. You remember that scene in Sex with Kings, where a concubine publicly shamas a ruler for being a 3-minute disappointment. It mirrors tales told in these old Arabic pages, except the critiques come with metaphors like a sword drawn, then sheathed without battle. Ouch. So you lie back now, surrounded by scrolls and sandalwood smoke, wondering how much of this was lived truth, and how much wishful thinking, penned by hopeful lovers with too much ink and not enough action. Either way, the picture is vivid. A culture that treated sex as a study, not a sin, and that's just our first glance. The real fireworks? Oh, they're coming. You wake up on a cushioned divan in the house of a vizier who has just handed you a parchment titled The Book of Delights. It smells faintly of rosewater and cloves, but when you open it, your eyebrows do a somersault. This isn't poetry, it's a 30-day challenge. Not for meditation, not for abs, for sex. You blink. Twice. Yes, the vizier has designed a month-long regimen of bedroom positions, each paired with advice on breathing, timing, and eye contact, like a medieval Kama Sutra crossed with a day planner. And this wasn't written for kicks, it was rooted in the belief that understanding the body's mechanics led to stronger relationships and, naturally, stronger empires. Because how could you run a caliphate if you didn't even know how to please your wife? In this world, sex is not a guilty pleasure, it's homework. Your lover's satisfaction? A daily responsibility. Their disappointment? A diplomatic failure. And if that sounds exhausting, well, imagine being expected to memorize metaphors like the leap of the panther or the resting of the crescent moon, and then reenact them under candlelight. No pressure. According to one court physician, rhythm is everything. Lose the rhythm and you risk the sadness of organs, which, in less poetic terms, meant erectile dysfunction and possibly social humiliation. There are even accounts of royal advisors diagnosing melancholy of the loins, as if your libido were a political crisis. The solution? A sequence of postures, touch techniques, and timing cues, many of which sound like advanced yoga. Except, instead of spiritual enlightenment, the goal is mutual bliss. Or at the very least, no tears and a good night's sleep. And here's where it gets even weirder. The vizier's manual doesn't just focus on heterosexual couples. Sprinkled among the chapters are occasional nods to male-male intimacy, described with the same anatomical precision and emotional curiosity. There are verses about shared pleasure, eye contact, and even jealousy without the typical moral panic you'd expect from a pre-modern society. Historians still argue whether this reflects social acceptance or simply literary tolerance, but the language is surprisingly tender. There's a passage where two lovers are described as mirrors of the moon, perfectly matching each other's light. Not exactly the wording you'd expect from a region later labeled puritanical by colonial historians. But again, we're in a different time zone here. A time when erotic knowledge was cataloged and exchanged like astronomy charts, when manuals were shared between physicians and poets, when understanding your partner's body was considered part of your education, not a luxury, not taboo, not shameful. Let's not forget, this was also the golden age of analogies. You didn't just kiss, you tasted the wind of paradise. You didn't caress. You guided your fingers like calligraphers on holy text. And if you dared to go too fast, one manual warns, you will bruise the rose before it blooms, and no bee returns to a spoiled flower. Ouch, emotional damage, and a gardening metaphor. But beneath the flowery language is a message shockingly aligned with modern intimacy wisdom. Slow down, listen, adapt. And for men who rushed or treated sex like a conquest, one scribe labels them donkeys in a library. Loud, clumsy, and likely to ruin everything. Honestly, not a bad insult. There's even discussion of psychological arousal. One manuscript advises lovers to exchange poetry before intimacy, not to impress, but to awaken the soul's readiness. Arousal, they believed, wasn't just physical. It began with anticipation, imagination, the flirtation of minds. In one erotic tale preserved from Andalusia, a noble woman rejects a suitor not because he's ugly, but because he recites dull verses. He offered me a stone where I had hoped for perfume, she sighs. And you sit there stunned. Was that a 10th century burn? Yes, it was. Now. Remember the sex with kings anecdote about Louis XV's mistress Madame du Barry keeping a private manual of aphrodisiac techniques and insisting that foreplay be a multi-course affair? There's a parallel here. 1. Arabic text outlines a full pleasure sequence, 6 phases of touch, 2 types of sound, and 3 recommended pauses. No rush, no skipping. It's as if they invented the blueprint for modern tantric playbooks, minus the incense commercials. Even stranger, these guides were shared in educational settings. Aspiring doctors studied them. Scholars quoted them. One university in Cairo allegedly held debates on whether rear entry from the left side was superior for conception under a full moon. Spoiler, no one agreed. And that brings us to the core of this entire sexual philosophy, the idea that pleasure, like music, requires rehearsal, harmony, and yes, mistakes. The 30-day challenge wasn't about dominance. It was about discipline. It trained you to be attuned, curious, and dare we say it, emotionally intelligent. If that feels progressive, it's because it is. And maybe it always has been. But history just tends to lose these stories under dust and doctrine. So here you are, sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by open scrolls, diagrams that would make your gym instructor blush, and notes from long-dead scholars who genuinely believed that good sex made you a better citizen. You roll your eyes, but also maybe take a few notes. Because even in the flickering candlelight of medieval Baghdad, one truth is clear: knowing your partner isn't just romantic, it's revolutionary. You're leafing through another manuscript. Now, one thicker than the rest. Its pages browned by time and probably sweat, if we're being honest. The title translates roughly to The Perfect Balance. And immediately you realize it's not about relationships, it's about parts. Specifically, body parts. You're plunged into a world where physicians, poets, and surprisingly blunt old men gathered around to debate the ideal size, shape, and behavior of genitals, like they were critiquing architecture. One diagram features a ruler. Another, a small sketch of what looks suspiciously like a carrot. In this moment, you're not in a mystical bazaar or a love story. You're in a medieval urology seminar that takes itself very seriously. The author likely a respected doctor declares that the optimal male member should be neither slender as a quill nor broad as a loaf, and must curve, ideally, like a bow strung for battle. That last part might have sounded poetic until you realize he means it literally. There are measurements. There are angles. There is math. What makes this even stranger is how obsessed these texts are with symmetry. Not just of the body, but of energy. One theory posits that when male and female bodies align correctly in shape and rhythm, their energies create a spiritual resonance. Sex, in this worldview, isn't just friction, it's alchemy. But there's anxiety too. Entire sections are devoted to men worrying whether they're adequate, while others advise on how to handle partners who seem, let's say, too well endowed. That's not new, right? Even today, locker room gossip and internet search tabs suggest the same fears echo across centuries. But here, they weren't jokes. They were medical concerns. One physician recommends a cooling poultice made of mint and goat's milk for men who are too inflamed in their desires, while another offers herbal compresses for men suffering from what he gently calls a disobedient softness. In the margin, someone scribbled a note, "Try honey and prayer." It's unclear which one was supposed to go first, but this isn't just about men. The next few pages dive deep, no pun intended, into the anatomy and preferences of women. You read through careful descriptions of internal structure, responses to touch, and even sensitivity zones categorized by type. Some sections are dryly scientific, but others read like love letters. She is not a vessel to be filled, one passage warns, but a storm to be calmed. The author goes on to say that the ideal partner knows her rhythms, waits for her readiness, and never assumes entry without permission. That's from a text written over 1,000 years ago. Meanwhile, somewhere today, someone's still tweeting that consent is confusing. Then comes the poetry. And oh, the poetry. One man compares his lover's body to a garden with gates that must be opened by song. Another complains, in what might be the most dramatic way possible, that his own inadequacy has made his wife dream of falcons instead of him. "She sees wings in her sleep, while I am but a featherless bird," he moans. Whether this is about performance or insecurity, you're not sure, but either way, it's oddly moving. You're reminded of a quote from the erotic Spirit Through History, where a 16th century noblewoman keeps a collection of men's letters ranked by how tragic their self-loathing is. She calls it her Book of Broken Birds. Honestly, iconic. And here's the fringe tidbit of the night. Medieval Arab physicians believed that the smell of sweat behind the ears could predict sexual compatibility. According to one source, if the scent was pleasant to your partner, it meant your bodily humors were in harmony. If it wasn't, well, you could try bathing in rosewater or chewing frankincense. But the manual suggested moving on. That's right, your ear funk was destiny. You imagine a couple in the year 1023, nervously leaning toward each other like two anxious teenagers sniffing for fate. Yet not all the texts are sweet or scientific. Some veer into deeply problematic territory, ranking body types, assigning moral value based on appearance, even suggesting that certain features predict infidelity. Historians still argue whether these were widely believed or just reflective of the author's biases, but the inconsistency is striking. One page praises diversity in bodies. Another claims thin lips signal dishonesty in bed. You frown, flipping back and forth, trying to reconcile a culture that wrote such sensitive prose about pleasure with one that casually judges a person's worth by their ankle width. It's a messy picture, but that's history complicated. Human, full of contradictions still. In the margins of all this odd geometry and sensual diagramming, you spot the through line. They cared. These people, scholars, scribes, lovers, cared enough to write, to question, to document the contours of intimacy like astronomers charting the stars. They argued over angles. They named positions after birds. They treated orgasms like divine messages. And in doing so, they left behind something more than just advice. They left proof that pleasure, insecurity, curiosity, and desire have always been universal. You place the book back on the table, its spine now familiar in your hands, and take a breath. You're starting to realize this isn't just about sex. It's about people desperately trying to make sense of each other through bodies, through metaphors, through math and myth, and the eternal hope that someone someday will write them a love poem so good it'll make them forget geometry entirely. You're in a hammam now, steam rising in soft waves, your ears picking up the low murmur of voices bouncing off tiled walls. Except these aren't the muffled prayers or marketplace gossip you'd expect. These are verses light, teasing, and unapologetically flirtatious. One woman chuckles as she recites a poem about a man whose enthusiasm outweighs his technique, while another corrects her with a line about lips softer than sherbet, but fingers like tongs. You freeze. These aren't men talking. These are women educated, sharp-tongued, and absolutely unafraid to talk about what turns them on, what turns them off, and who failed miserably at both. Welcome to the part of medieval Arabic society they rarely put in textbooks, the one where female desire wasn't just acknowledged. It was discussed, debated, and sometimes performed aloud, under no veil of modesty. There's a scroll tucked under a bath mat, yes, really filled with the poems of Walada bint al-Mustakfi, a caliph's daughter turned scandalous wordsmith who once walked into court with verses embroidered on her robe. I am made for greatness, and I walk proud. She wrote love poems to women. She mocked men who disappointed her. And once, when a poet lover tried to shame her in public, she retaliated by writing an erotic parody of his best verse and performing it at a banquet. You have to admire the energy. Imagine a Beyoncé-Taylor Swift hybrid with a library card and zero fear of social backlash. These weren't quiet figures. They were rock stars in ink-stained shoes. You dig deeper. More manuscripts, more female voices, some preserved, others pieced together from scraps and references. One woman writes that her husband climbs like a cat but forgets to purr. Another offers detailed advice to her daughter on how to recognize. If a man is selfish in bed, she lists 4 warning signs, one of which involves how he reacts to silences. These aren't shy whispers. These are battle songs, passed from hand to hand in salons, homes, and yes, hammams. Historians still argue whether these expressions reflect widespread freedom or were limited to elite circles, but the voices themselves? Unmistakably real. And loud. And then you stumble on a diary possibly fictional, but wildly popular in its time, where a woman documents her lovers like a 10th century Carrie Bradshaw. She rates them. She writes about what worked, what didn't, and in one scathing entry, compares a lover's technique to being hugged by a scroll rack firm, lifeless, and too full of itself. Brutal. You can't help but laugh, then pause. Because under the sass, there's something revolutionary. These texts don't just express pleasure, they demand it. These women aren't accessories to male desire. They're protagonists in their own narratives. Even more surprising is the medical literature. Female anatomy is studied with intricate diagrams and surprisingly respectful language. One physician writes about the gate of pleasure with the same reverence he uses for the heart. Another advises that women's satisfaction must come first, because like rain before the seed, it softens the earth. Cheesy? Yes. Accurate? Also yes. And before you assume this was all metaphor and myth, consider this. Some manuals recommend actual techniques, pressure points, breath control, sequences of touch, all focused on female climax. You raise an eyebrow. Modern sex ed could take notes. And here's your quirky tidbit. Midwives in medieval Damascus kept small journals pocket-sized where they tracked unusual anatomical findings and birth outcomes. But some included notes like, client prefers fingers over tongue, or husband unaware of proper rhythm. These weren't just medical logs. They were whisper networks, advice columns, and quiet protest. It's as if these women knew. They were part of something fragile but powerful. A culture that, for all its contradictions, made space, however brief, for their pleasure to matter. But not everything is rosy steam and poetry. You also find traces of shame, of regulation. Some texts accuse outspoken women of being too hot, both literally and morally. There were efforts, especially during political shifts, to rein in these voices, to rewrite them as cautionary tales, and yet the poems survive, scribbled in margins, memorized and recited, hidden between pages of religious law like a secret flame that refuses to go out. It's easy to forget, in the glare of modern headlines about repression, that these women existed, bold, sarcastic, sensual, and they didn't whisper. They roared. You imagine them sitting in a courtyard at dusk, passing fruit, quoting poems, and trading advice with the precision of scholars and the mischief of sisters. You wonder what they'd think of today. Would they envy your freedom or pity your algorithms? Would they tweet anonymous threads about the decline of pillow talk, or host wildly popular podcasts with titles like The Pleasure Caliphate? What you know for sure is this: their stories were not supposed to survive, but they did. And in reading them, you realize something a little unsettling, that maybe history didn't erase them. It just hid them under enough dust, shame, and academic footnotes that no one bothered to look. But now you're looking. And the further you read, the more impossible it becomes to unsee. Female desire, long assumed to be silenced, was right. They're inscribed in ink, carved in metaphor, and whispered like prophecy in the steam of the hammam. And now that you've heard it, you'll never not hear it again. You're wandering through a spice market now, overwhelmed by scents that seem to flirt with your nose: cinnamon, cardamom, crushed rose petals, and something more elusive like burning amber mixed with mint. It isn't just for show. These aren't just ingredients for perfume or stews. You've entered a world where love, lust, and longing are brewed like medicine, prescribed by physicians, and whispered between lovers like spells. You stop at a stall with glass vials and handwritten tags, each one claiming to stir the heart. Or other parts further south. One bottle reads, "For nights of great demand," another, "For the reluctant moon." You blink. Welcome to the strange and sticky universe of medieval Arabic aphrodisiacs, where everything from pigeon meat to sparrow brains was ground, soaked, sipped, or smeared, all in the name of better sex. A physician named Al-Razi swore by roasted onions soaked in honey, claiming they increased endurance and made a man sway like a willow in wind, but never fall. Another swore by fried locusts, don't ask. One popular recipe involved 7 almonds, 3 cloves of garlic, a dash of cinnamon, and you're not ready for this, a powder made from dried lizard tails. Mix with warm goat milk. Serve at dawn. For women, the suggestions were even more specific. Cloves to warm the blood, fenugreek to increase response, and disturbingly often, sparrow brain mashed into a paste and smeared on the chest, supposedly to awaken buried desires. You wonder how many birds had to die for someone's hot date in 964 CE. Then there were tonics, herbal cocktails steeped in red wine or vinegar, depending on whether you were trying to spark energy or calm nerves. Some recipes insisted the mixture be blessed or recited over with verses. Others demanded silence during preparation, as if the herbs themselves might change their minds if you talk too much. But these weren't just witchy experiments. They were based, however loosely, on the humoral theory of medicine. Bodies were believed to be governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and good sex required a balance of all 4. If your bile was too hot, you were impatient. If your phlegm dominated, too cold, too distant. There were even charts, yes, charts, matching personality types to recommended positions, aphrodisiacs, and pillow talk. You start to think maybe this was less about love and more about advanced chemistry with benefits. Here's your fringe tidbit. In parts of 11th century Aleppo, pharmacists were required to memorize at least 10 aphrodisiac recipes before they could open shop. One popular blend was called the drummer's heart and included crushed beetle shells, ginger, honey, and saffron. Side effects, according to the manual: singing loudly and forgetting modesty. You raise an eyebrow. Sounds like karaoke. Night with a twist dot, but beneath the exotic ingredients and strange animal parts lies a curious truth. People have always been trying to bridge the frustrating gap between desire and reality. One scroll reads, "When the heart burns but the body sleeps, bring it to wake with figs and almond oil." Another advises couples to chew fennel together before intimacy, so their breaths would harmonize. There's something deeply tender in that image: two people, mouths full of herbs, trying to meet each other halfway. Still, not all advice aged well. One text insists that rubbing fresh leech juice on your thighs will increase passion. Another suggests that to ensure loyalty, one should mix a partner's hair into a honey cake. We don't recommend either. But there's something charming about how much energy went into trying. Whether they were grinding ginseng, boiling pigeon broth, or sneaking nutmeg into wine, these lovers weren't passive. They were alchemists of the heart, and very possibly the gastrointestinal system. Remember that story from The History of Sexuality, where Foucault talks about how ancient societies linked diet, discipline, and sexuality into a complete system of selfhood. That's exactly what's happening here. The act of making love wasn't separated from daily life. It was life. It had its own medicine, its own rituals, even its own shopping lists. These concoctions weren't always effective, but they were expressions of care, of effort, of hope. Because when desire faltered, they didn't blame fate. They reached for cumin seeds. And just when you think you've seen it all, you stumble on the oddest prescription yet. A thin strip of parchment reads, "For mutual pleasure, boil basil leaves under the moon, mix with honey, and recite together this verse. We meet not as fire and wind, but as thread and needle." You pause. It's not just medicine. It's poetry disguised as instruction. Romance hidden in ritual. Maybe none of it worked. Or maybe all of it did, because belief, anticipation, and intention are their own kind of chemistry. And maybe that's the point. You tuck the parchment back into the basket. The market bustles on. Behind you, a couple debates the virtues of cinnamon versus cardamom, their hands already entwined. And you're starting to see that in the medieval Arabic world. Love wasn't something you waited for. It was something you brewed. Boldly, clumsily, passionately. With spice, with science, and with a little bit of sparrow. You duck into a courtyard where the call to prayer has just echoed across the rooftops. And there, seated beneath a fig tree with a manuscript balanced on his knee, is a man who looks like a holy scholar. Bearded, serene, dressed in flowing white robes, he traces the lines of his book slowly, lips moving. You assume it's a religious text. Until he reads aloud. It is not fitting for a man to approach his wife as if entering battle, but as one entering the garden of the beloved, with patience and reverence. You blink. Is this scripture or foreplay? The man looks up and sees your confusion. He smiles knowingly, because you've just met one of the most unexpected voices in this whole story. A medieval religious scholar who believed, quite seriously, that good sex made you a better Muslim. Welcome to the theological wild card. A school of thought in early Islamic intellectual life that argued, sometimes with alarming anatomical enthusiasm, that sexual fulfillment was not merely permissible, but recommended as a path to spiritual clarity. There's a book beside the scholar's elbow, worn and lovingly annotated. The title translates roughly to On the Etiquette of Intimacy, and it's written by a 13th century jurist named Al-Suyuti. This isn't some anonymous fringe writer. Al-Suyuti was prolific, well-respected, and deeply religious. And in this text he writes openly about foreplay, rhythm, mutual satisfaction. And brace yourself, recommended durations. Yes, durations. As in, how long is long enough to demonstrate compassion, attentiveness, and a proper balance of desire. You start to realize that in this corner of the medieval world, Sex was considered a gift from God, not something to be hidden behind shame or left to guesswork. And here comes the part where your eyebrows may never lower again. Some religious texts claim that a man who neglected his wife's pleasure could be questioned in the afterlife. Not punished, maybe, but definitely asked, did you show kindness in approach? Did you allow her to reach fulfillment? That's not a bedtime chat. That's a theological audit. And while interpretations varied, some scholars leaned conservative, others exuberant, the fact remains, sex was a matter of the soul as much as the skin. This is where it gets delicate, because not all schools of Islamic thought agreed. Historians still argue whether these texts reflected a wide consensus or just a particularly expressive strain of scholarship. But what's undeniable is that these writings existed. They were copied, circulated, and sometimes cited in sermons. They weren't hidden in basements. They were part of the library. Here's something that might break your brain a little further. One text draws a connection between the timing of prayers and the timing of intimacy, suggesting that lovers who aligned their acts with spiritual rhythms achieved greater peace. There's even a line that reads, "He who satisfies the beloved before the dawn prayer is doubly rewarded." Whether this was meant literally or metaphorically is up for debate, but the implication is their sexual pleasure, when framed with respect and mutual consent, enhances spiritual harmony, and their science too, or at least what passed for it then. The same scholars who wrote about jurisprudence also dabbled in anatomy, often borrowing from Greek sources. They describe erogenous zones in clinical detail, sometimes naming 40 or more for women alone. One manual lists the nape of the neck, the space between the third and fourth ribs, and the back of the knee as areas to be approached with care and poetry. Not force, not speed, poetry. You laugh quietly. Imagine a man today pulling out a scroll and saying, "Ah yes, I must attend to the third rib space with a sonnet." And here's your quirky tidbit for the night. A 12th century mystic once claimed that if a man recited a verse from the Quran during climax, the angels would pause their record-keeping out of respect. This was hotly debated. Some said it was blasphemous, others claimed it was divine unity in action. But the sheer fact that someone proposed it and others discussed it tells you how blurred the lines were between sacred and sensual in this world. But the tone shifts sometimes. A few texts grow stern, warning against arrogance in bed, or cruelty, or neglect. One scholar warns men not to treat the wife as the field, but as the fruit of the garden. There's a morality in these instructions, a belief that sex reveals character, that how you love someone reflects how you see the divine. It's a heavy thought for a quiet night. But maybe that's the point. You look at the scholar again. He's now reading a different passage, this one comparing the union of two lovers to the joining of rivers that flow to the same sea. No performance, no conquest, just a meeting, a completion. And it's not a coincidence that many of these religious texts end not with rules, but with blessings. May you sleep full of peace, having loved well and listened better. You feel that line settle into your bones. You were expecting fire and brimstone. Instead, you got softness, encouragement, even tenderness. And maybe that's the surprise. In this imagined landscape of medieval austerity, you've stumbled into a garden, not just of pleasure, but of ethics, of thoughtfulness, of sacred sensuality. And somehow, without realizing it, you've begun to see sex not as a separate act from spirituality, but a reflection of it. A mirror, held gently in lamplight, asking not just what you do, but how. You open your eyes and you're in the middle of a wedding procession, drums pulsing like heartbeats, lanterns bobbing in the air like fireflies, the scent of orange blossom and sweat dancing together under the velvet night. The bride sits atop a palanquin draped in crimson silk, her hands painted with henna that hides tiny poems, and in your lap, a small rolled scroll, discreetly passed from an older woman with a smile too knowing to be innocent. Advice, she whispers, for your wedding night. You unroll it, expecting something vague and polite. Instead, you're hit with blunt instructions, cautionary tales, and what can only be described as an etiquette guide for sex, emotional hygiene, and oddly dental care. Welcome to the awkwardly earnest, occasionally hilarious world of medieval Arabic marriage manuals. The scroll opens with a warning. Do not surprise your spouse like a thief in the night. Right, ease into it, talk, laugh, then comes tip. Number 2. Check your breath, for no one enjoys kisses that taste of last week's onion stew. You snort, but it gets better. There's an actual recipe for a pre-bedtime mouth rinse, mint, cardamom, and a drop of rose water. The logic? Romance begins with breath, not bravado. And suddenly, you realize this isn't just about sex, it's about presence. These people weren't whispering vague ideas about connection. They were handing out checklists. You keep reading. A chapter titled, Of First Embraces, advises couples to speak softly, move slowly, and avoid rushing as though time itself is impatient. Another recommends specific compliments to offer. Your scent is like spring after rain, or your gaze weakens me more than battle. They may sound over the top, but in a world where poetry was currency, these lines were gold. And here's the wild part, they weren't just for men to say to women. Some were scripted for women to say back. Mutual admiration was not only allowed, it was encouraged. And yet, not everything so dreamy. The same scroll includes some deeply dated advice, including the assumption that women were less interested in sex and had to be coaxed into it. But just 2 pages later, the writer does a full reversal. A wise husband will learn that her fire lies beneath still waters. You blink. Did they just admit that women are sexual beings, but require trust and care to ignite? Yes, they did. It's clumsy and inconsistent, but undeniably curious. Like they were grappling with something they didn't fully understand but wanted to. There's even a section on postcoital decorum. It advises cuddling, gentle words, and not turning your back immediately like a camel who's drunk. His fill and now wanders off. That image is hard to unsee, but it makes a point being present matters. One part reads, love is not just in entering, but in staying. And that, surprisingly, still hits. Your fringe tidbit tonight? In some households, a new couple's first night was quietly monitored by women from the courtyard or next room to ensure everything was consensual and smooth. Not to invade, but to protect. If a woman cried out in distress, aunts or midwives might intervene. It was a safety net, dressed as tradition. There are even stories of older women leaving little notes or charms under the couple's bed, spiritual, medical, or emotional reminders that intimacy is a shared, evolving thing. And remember that scene from Sex with Kings, where a queen-to-be is coached by a retired courtesan on how to navigate her royal husband's ego with just the right amount of praise and indifference. That same dynamic shows up here. One section advises the bride not to exhaust all mystery at once, suggesting that restraint is not coyness but strategy. Keep a little for tomorrow. Let desire simmer. It's oddly modern advice for a millennium old pamphlet wrapped in jasmine-scented twine. But what's most fascinating is the emotional literacy. One scroll advises, when your partner seems distant, do not accuse. Ask if the soul is heavy. That's not just good bedroom advice. That's good life advice. These manuals weren't just about sex, they were blueprints for companionship. Filled with clumsy metaphors and strange similes, sure, but also deep emotional insight. One even suggests practicing gratitude after intimacy. Hold their hand and thank them, for they shared their breath with yours. You sit with that line for a moment. Shared breath. Shared time, not conquest, not duty. A kind of sacred exchange, and yet there's humor too. One entry includes a list of moods to avoid, including being hungry, angry, sleepy, or having just argued with your uncle about goats. You laugh, it's absurd, But also they're not wrong. Timing, mood, and emotional safety matter. These weren't just practical guides. They were cultural maps, attempts to chart love's absurd, beautiful, confusing terrain. So now you're sitting under that fig tree, surrounded by musicians, laughter, and the soft clink of tea glasses, thinking about how much care went into preparing people for something we still struggle to talk about today. And maybe it's not that different, really. We still seek connection, still hope we're doing it right, still read too many listicles about 10 ways to make them fall in love with you. Except back then, the list came with rhymes, rituals, and the subtle scent of cardamom. You roll up the scroll and tuck it into your robe. The night hums with possibility. And somewhere behind a carved wooden screen, two newlyweds begin writing their own version of an ancient story. One touch, one word, one slow breath at a time. A candle flickers. The room smells like crushed coriander and smoke, the kind that sticks to fabric and memory. You're sitting across from a man with a limp and a lopsided turban who swears, without blinking, that he once seduced a noble woman using only a spoon, a melon, and 3 lines of poetry. You'd laugh, but the other men in the room nod gravely, as if this is perfectly reasonable. Welcome to the Tavern of Sexual Mishaps and Cautionary Tales, a corner of medieval Arabic literature that trades silk-draped fantasy for a healthy dose of awkward, honest failure. You thought it was all rose oil and moonlit metaphors? No. Tonight, we meet the people who mixed too much honey with too little self-awareness and paid the very itchy price. You're handed a book. The title translates, bluntly, to asterisk the book of errors in the acts of love asterisk. Its pages are stained, torn, and heavily annotated. Apparently, it was well read. One story describes a man who, desperate to impress a new wife, consumes an entire roasted onion, believing it will enhance his stamina. It does not. Instead, he faints from stomach cramps, and she sends him home with a note, "Return when your breath no longer offends Allah." Another tale tells of a couple who try a newly discovered position of the inverted acrobat and end up entangled in such a way that they require the help of 3 ants and a curtain rod to separate. It's funny, yes, but it's also strangely reassuring. Because even 1,000 years ago, people were trying, failing, laughing, and trying again. You start to see a pattern in these stories: ambition outpacing ability, ego derailed by biology. One manuscript describes a man who prepares a love potion using the famous trio: honey, saffron, and crushed dates, but doubles the dose in hopes of transcending the realm of mortals. Instead, he vomits during foreplay and develops a mild rash. He writes later in his own footnote, "Let love be enough. Spices are not salvation." You wish someone had embroidered that on a pillow. Here's your fringe tidbit tonight. One widely circulated medical guide warned against mixing garlic and camel milk before intimacy, stating it could confuse the blood and cause spontaneous nosebleeds. The same guide also discouraged making love during a full moon while facing north, claiming it weakened the spirit and emboldened jinn. Whether you buy the mysticism or not, it's clear that for every rule about how to seduce, there were 10 more about what not to do. And often, the don'ts were rooted not in shame, but in hard-earned experience. Or, in some cases, mild trauma involving pigeon feathers and bad timing. But not all the mishaps are slapstick. Some are emotional. There's a story about a man who brags too much, promising a lover the waves of the sea and the fire of the sun, only to grow silent and withdrawn after a fumbling attempt. She, frustrated, writes him a letter. "You gave me the ocean, but brought no boat." That line gets copied, quoted, turned into a popular burn across salons in Cairo. The poor man never lives it down. And yet, beneath the mockery, there's a quiet lesson: intimacy isn't just performance. It's presence. It's humility. It's knowing when not to overpromise and when to admit you're human. Some of these stories were used as teaching tools. One medical manual includes a section titled Signs That You Should Stop, and the list includes everything from physical fatigue to when you begin reciting verse not meant for this moment. The implication? If your mind is wandering to politics, taxes, or that poem you never finished, you may need to take a break. Self-awareness was, apparently, part of good form. And remember that moment in the erotic spirit through history, where Peter Webb describes the infamous 14th century nobleman who tried to revive his fading reputation with a scandalous public. Affair only for his lover to publish a scathing critique of his technique in poetic couplets. That exact energy exists here. Medieval Arabic writers didn't just document sex. They documented disappointment, resentment, and the awkward collisions of expectation versus reality. And they did it with humor. One woman writes that her lover approached like thunder, delivered like drizzle. You wince. Then you laugh. Then you realize how timeless that sentiment really is. But these cautionary tales aren't cruel. They don't mock for the sake of it. They remind us that even in a society that prized eloquence, seduction, and skill, failure was part of the journey. One old man, quoted in a sidebar of a 12th century text, puts it best: you must trip to learn the rhythm. You must sweat to know the breeze. You imagine him chuckling over tea, a veteran of both love and humility. So here you are, surrounded by stories that didn't end in fireworks, but in bruised egos, second chances, and awkward silences broken by laughter. And it's strangely comforting. Because if even the great lovers of the Golden Age had nights of regret, allergic reactions, and premature declarations of immortality, maybe you can stop beating yourself up about the one time you sent that text at 2 a.m. and got left unread. The library is dark now, lit only by a single oil lamp and the soft amber glow reflecting off brass book clasps. You pull a scroll from a carved chest labeled "Do Not Copy Without Permission," and the first thing you see is a line of poetry that stops your breath. His eyes said what no sermon dared, and his hand touched mine like morning touches stone. It's not about a man and a woman. It's about two men, one a court musician, the other a scholar who knew better, or thought he did. You've just opened a door few are willing to acknowledge existed. Welcome to the whispered, inked, and sometimes shockingly open world of same-sex desire in the medieval Arabic world. You were told it was all forbidden, all suppressed. But here it is laid out in rhyming couplets, legal treatises, and even advice manuals. And it's not always hidden in code. Sometimes it's blunt, tender, erotic, or heartbreakingly unreturned. One famous poet, Abu Nuwas, yes, that Abu Nuwas, court jester and literary legend, wrote dozens of poems about his lovers, many of whom were young men. He describes wine, skin, jealousy, the ache of waiting, the thrill of risk. If loving him is sin, he writes, then hell has never tasted so sweet. These weren't whispers in the shadows. They were recited at dinner parties, painted on walls, etched into memory. And yes, sometimes censored later, but not always. And it wasn't just poetry. Medical and philosophical texts of the era debated whether love between men was natural, spiritual, or dangerous. Some argued it was purest because it was less rooted in reproduction. Others worried it distracted from family duties. Still others just shrugged and wrote, "The heart chooses where it is drawn." That's not modern liberalism talking. That's from a 12th century commentary on desire written by a judge in Damascus. Historians still argue whether these were common beliefs or rare expressions, but the fact they were written at all, preserved, even celebrated in some circles, that tells you something bigger was happening. Even stranger are the etiquette guides that don't avoid the topic. They lean into it. One text gives advice to young men trying to impress their male patrons. Do not flatter his poetry if you cannot remember it later. Another warns about jealousy among lovers sharing the same master. There are case studies, yes, actual case studies of love triangles gone wrong, dramatic public breakups, and one account of a scholar who faked a fever to avoid seeing his ex at a palace banquet. You'd laugh if it didn't sound exactly like your friend's group chat last week. There's a debate, of course. Some scholars insist these writings were metaphorical, that the male beloveds were poetic devices, not real people. Others argue, with growing evidence, that this was no metaphor, that love, desire, and relationships between men and sometimes between women were part of the social fabric, especially in elite and artistic circles. It wasn't always safe. It wasn't always stable. But it was there. Alive, aching, and written down. And here's your fringe detail for tonight. A popular 13th century matchmaking guide includes a brief but curious section titled On the Beauty of the Boy's Nape, describing the appeal of curls, posture, and perfume. It's oddly specific, weirdly tender, and deeply suggestive. But even more curious is the note that follows. Beware, for longing without discretion becomes obsession. You can almost hear the author sighing through time. These were real feelings, real risks, real lives. Female same-sex desire appears too, though less frequently and usually more disguised. One set of poems, attributed to an anonymous woman in Busra, speaks of a friendship so intense it becomes unbearable. She leaned on me like dusk on the dunes, and I feared the morning. It's subtle, but powerful. And you wonder how many women hid their passion in plain sight, braiding their longing into lullabies, mourning the intimacy they could never fully name. And yet, despite all this, the same culture that recorded these moments also imposed limits. Some jurists condemned same-sex acts harshly. Punishments varied by region, ruler, and religious school. There were periods of tolerance and periods of crackdown. It was never simple, never consistent, never fully one thing, which makes it even more haunting and more human. Remember that section in Foucault's History of Sexuality, where he warns us not to reduce past sexual identities into modern categories. That rings loud here. These weren't gay or straight identities in the way we frame them now. They were experiences, relationships, rituals, risks, sometimes joyful, sometimes hidden, sometimes punished, sometimes sung from balconies, after 3 cups of wine. And all of them real. So now you're sitting cross-legged on a carpet that smells of cedar and thyme, holding a scroll that both shocks and soothes you. You've seen lovers meet in secret gardens, argue in verse, get caught in legal disputes, and immortalize heartbreak in lines so beautiful you want to steal them for your own texts. And the realization settles in slow, like cooling tea. Intimacy, real intimacy, doesn't always ask permission. It shows up. It complicates things. It writes itself into corners and then finds a way out. And sometimes in the quiet gaps between rules and rituals, it blossoms. You step through a crumbling archway, half covered in ivy and dust, and find yourself inside a forgotten library where the walls hum with the weight of vanished empires. You've walked through passion, prayer, potions, poetry, and now you stand in front of a battered wooden chest labeled in faded ink, translations and bans. This is where it ends, or rather where it continues. Because what happens next isn't a slow fade into obscurity. It's an explosion of cultural transmission, censorship, and rebirth. Tonight, you trace how the moans and metaphors of medieval Arabic sex manuals crossed borders, shocked monks, seduced Renaissance scholars, and ultimately changed the story of human desire forever. You open the chest. Inside, bundled scrolls and stitched codices written in Latin, French, Italian, all translations of the very texts you've been following. Some are careful, some are embellished, and one looks like it was translated by someone who either didn't understand Arabic or was so scandalized they edited half the lines into spiritual metaphors. Still, the originals made it out. They traveled along trade routes, tucked between texts on astronomy and medicine, often carried by Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars who valued knowledge, even if they didn't always agree on how much skin was acceptable in a footnote. And here's the twist: the earliest European sex guides, many borrowed directly from these Arabic texts. They just changed the names, removed the poetry, and toned down the sparrow brains. One particular manuscript, the Book of Elegant Love, was copied in 15th century Naples and sold in secret to wealthy patrons. It combined parts of the Perfumed Garden, Galenic anatomy, and good old-fashioned gossip. In one annotated copy, a monk underlined a passage about rhythm and wrote in the margin, "Too lively for Lent." You can almost hear his sigh, yet he kept reading. Because even the most devout couldn't help but be curious. But curiosity had consequences. As the church tightened its grip on printed material, these works were banned, burned, or locked away. Still, they resurfaced through underground presses, whispered citations, and clever disguises. In one case, an erotic Arabic poem was passed off as a Greek love spell to avoid ecclesiastical suspicion. In another, a 17th century physician simply forgot to cite his Arabic sources when describing foreplay techniques in his popular Guide for the Health of Marital Union. Bold move, but it worked. Meanwhile, over in Ottoman Istanbul, the originals were still being copied, read, and debated. New commentaries emerged. Some argued for modernizing the advice, others insisted on preserving the classics. One scholar in 1621 even published a rebuttal to the Book of Delights, claiming that one position caused philosophical melancholy if repeated too often. You're not entirely sure what that means, but you do admire the conviction. Fast forward a few centuries, and we land in colonial Europe, where Orientalist scholars swoop in, hunting for scandal. They translate Arabic erotic texts with equal parts fascination and condescension, often distorting the tone. A line meant to celebrate mutual pleasure becomes in English a crude instruction manual. The original metaphors, gardens, rivers, celestial alignments, are flattened into clunky prose. The tenderness is lost, the point missed. But the legacy survives. Here's your final fringe tidbit. In 19th century Paris, a secret society of scholars known as les appreciateurs du savoir perdu, the appreciators of lost knowledge, held private readings of forbidden Arabic erotic texts in candlelit basements. Members included professors, artists, and at least one duchess. They read slowly, reverently, often with wine, sometimes with tears. Because even in translation, even filtered through time and politics and prejudice, something essential remained. The echo of a culture that dared to teach love with precision, curiosity, and poetry. You sit now among these smuggled words, realizing that the story wasn't erased, it just shifted shapes. The manuals were never just about sex. They were about care, complexity, vulnerability. They treated desire as something worthy of respect, even reverence. And in that way, they outlived their borders. Their authors never imagined TikTok or Reddit threads on how to tell if he's faking it, but they did imagine a world where people could be taught to listen, touch, wait, and try again. So here we are. You've walked 10 centuries barefoot through silk and ink, stumbled over bad metaphors, met women who roasted their lovers in verse, scholars who saw foreplay as a path to God, men who mistook pigeon soup for passion, and 1,000 quiet voices who just wanted to be known. You're not just reading history, you're holding it. And it's warm. Now, as the oil lamp dims and the library begins to breathe with the sound of night, you feel the dust settling back onto the scrolls. But something's shifted, because you've seen what most people miss, that history isn't always a list of dates and wars. Sometimes it's a whisper passed between lovers, a recipe scribbled in the corner of a manuscript, a joke shared in a bathhouse, a truth told in the dark. Let your breath slow now. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the last images linger, not of caliphs or scholars, but of soft voices in soft light. of hands learning their way across unfamiliar terrain with patience and awe. History, like love, is rarely neat. It's stitched together by imperfect people trying to understand each other in the quiet between rules. You've heard their laughter, their longing, their late-night regrets scribbled in margins. And now, as you settle deeper into the quiet, let their voices fade, not into silence, but into the comfort of knowing that you too are part of the same search, the same dance, the same delight. Rest now, knowing that curiosity is older than shame, and tenderness is never out of style. You've read well. You've listened closely. And somewhere, a scribe from 1,000 years ago smiles, knowing his story made it to you. End of script. Sweet dreams.